very good morning to all of our plumbers. So to start off our Toolbox Talk for this morning, we want to remind you about the tips to continually prevent COVID-19. And as we've mentioned before, not only does this prevent COVID-19, but also other unwanted occupational diseases. As a plumber, you are putting your hands into some pretty dangerous situations, and it is needed because you are the ones that bring life into a building by ensuring that waste and disposal gets removed. Now, when working in these situations, obviously we are touching bacteria, we are touching viruses, all sorts of potentially dangerous things that could contaminate our bodies. And so washing your hands regularly for 20 seconds with soap and water is obviously a good thing to do, no matter what the situation is. But to continue to prevent COVID-19, we encourage you to please keep an alcohol-based hand sanitizer with you at all times in case you don't have access to regular hand washing stations or soap where you are. But it is a good idea to try and keep fresh water and soap with you. Avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth if you have not washed your hands, and then adhere to your social distancing measures. I know some companies, some of our plumbers have already been speaking to us about the sites that they're working on, and social distancing is still big on certain sites, specifically in the mining area. Then avoid close contact with people who are sick. Cover your cough or sneeze with a flexed elbow or tissue and throw that tissue into the bin. And then something we cannot stress enough is cleaning and disinfecting frequently touched objects and surfaces. You can be very clean, but if somebody else potentially contaminates it, or you're passing around tools on site, obviously this is how flu or even COVID-19 or other bacteria can spread from one person to the next. So it's just good hygiene practice all around. And then again, adhere to your vaccination policies for each of your companies. Now, to get started in our Toolbox Talk, we've mentioned this past month that we want to constantly look at what is affecting the plumbers out in the industry. And we've spoken about cancer at the beginning of the year. We looked at the emergency situations that we might face, such as things with hot works. If you are doing hot works, basic first aid because of injuries, and then hot works may also include fire, which is why we spoke about firefighting. So it is obvious that we have to move into the final one of emergency evacuation. Now, for emergencies, we understand that an emergency situation can arise at any time. It is obviously an unwanted event, and that is why we take a look at what our safety thought is for this week. Safety is achieved by teamwork. It is of utmost importance that every single person within your company, doesn't matter who they are, even if they're not driving out to site, knows and understands the emergency situation. You'll never know who you need to pull into a situation to be able to assist you or others in that emergency. So an emergency is obviously an unplanned event. In other words, it is something that you can plan for, but you do not know when it is going to happen. But there is only so much you can do to plan for an emergency. But in order to be defined as an emergency, the situation should threaten life, health, property, or the environment. It either has already caused the loss of life or put the health of people in danger. It's damaged property or the environment, or it has a high probability to escalate and causing danger or loss of life, loss of property, or danger to the environment. Now, why do we have to define what an emergency is? Well, for most sites, emergency evacuation plans are always in place. You are not going to evacuate the place because you've had a small fire in one small area of the construction site. You see, you might have a partial evacuation of the area, but maybe not of the entire site. Because an emergency situation is defined as threatening life, health, property, or the environment. Now, on a larger scale, on construction sites or perhaps in buildings, you are not always going to just evacuate. So when we talk about emergency evacuation, there are a few things to consider. We don't just want to leave the area. What we want to try and do is work as a team first. Thinking of zero is no accident. We do it because we've planned for incidents and accidents to occur, and we've planned for emergency situations. You then now put this planning into practice. You see, you are prepared with the regular things that most companies should have in place in order to protect yourself against an emergency. And this is no different being on your client's site. You might not be the one fighting the fire, providing the first aid while you're on a client site. You might not even be the emergency coordinator of your group. Maybe the client takes over in an emergency situation. What is needed, though, is for you to know and understand what those emergency situations or evacuation procedures are for your client. So this is generally part of the induction side when you get to a client. And this is whether you're working at a bank, whether you're working in normal offices, whether you're working on a construction site, or even if you're working in a private home. Now you might be saying, Chris, I've never been into a private home where they have an emergency evacuation plan. Well, they probably do. It just is not written down on paper. You see, in an emergency situation, they've got a plan of what they would do, and it's just a spoken plan. So they've got a verbal plan, and they know what to do. They know that there's a shut-off valve, perhaps for gas in a certain area. So if something happens and there is a fire, they can go and shut off the emergency valve. They know where perhaps a fire extinguisher is, or how to get a hose pipe into that private home at any given stage. So they know and understand the area because they live in that building. So although it might not be a documented emergency plan, it is still an emergency plan. Now, obviously for companies, we need to have these documented. So the plan that you've been speaking about within your company, do you have an actual documented plan for some of the most common plumbing emergencies? Well, this is what we found out in the plumbing industry. So we've spoken to a lot of our members. We sent out a poll as well. We've also sent out the email that has an incident reporting system. So it's an anonymous reporting system for any incidents and accidents that occur in the plumbing industry. Now, you don't have to be in the plumbing industry to send us information on the plumbing industry. Perhaps you've got a plumber working for you. And we know that many safety officers actually join our Toolbox Talks in the morning. And if you perhaps have a plumber on site and you've experienced something, please send us that information, because it helps us to understand what is actually happening out in the plumbing industry. And this then assists us with designing methodologies to protect our plumbers, and then giving advice to say, this is what's happening to other plumbers in the industry. Can we prevent it happening to you? So some of the most common plumbing emergencies that we've seen, and if this is not something you are facing and you are facing something else, please let us know. We want to include this information and then research that information to give you the most accurate solutions. Serious medical emergencies was something that we saw. Cancer, we have spoken about that, because you are working outside all the time. You're working in the sun a lot of the times. And the need to look after our skin, to look after our bodies, specifically for future, is so important, because there is a high possibility for cancer. Now, there is other cancers, obviously, that is aside from skin cancer, such as lung cancer. And that is mainly for people who smoke. And that is also a high probability amongst a lot of our plumbers. We've spoken to them, and quite a high number or high percentage of plumbers actually do smoke. Then heat stroke, because some of the situations that you're getting yourself into is extremely warm. Now, it might include being outside, being in the actual sun, but here we're talking about some of the confined spaces that you have to get into, some of the ceilings that you've got to enter into, and some other areas where the plumbing is actually working, specifically hot works or hot water plumbing, being in and around geysers or boilers, and that is just increasing the heat in and around that area. So it might not feel too hot once you walk into it, but working in there, exerting yourself physically, getting your body temperature up, plus the heat in the area, it has a high probability to turn into heat stroke. Now, remember, heat stroke can become a very serious condition, and this is very common amongst many plumbers. Sometimes you feel a bit dizzy, you start sweating a little bit more, and that is why it is so important to follow those procedures that we spoke about during our heat toolbox talk, which was last month. Certain diseases that you are going to be exposed to, and aside from COVID-19, we know COVID-19 is still out there and many are still being affected by it. But as a plumber, you might not come into contact much with COVID-19, but what you are coming into contact with are other types of diseases. Things like Legionnaire's disease that we've spoken about, which is naturally found in our entire environment. So you might think, well, Chris, that's everyone then. If it's so widely available, every single person in the world will be exposed to it. And yes, you would be correct. But you as a plumber are the one not creating it, but directly attaching yourself to the very area where it is growing, the heated water, the ground in excavation. And that is where it is thriving and where you are breathing in this potentially dangerous bacteria. Other types of diseases, such as you get from water or dirty water, or perhaps bacteria or any other hazardous biological agent that you might find in sewage pipes or underground piping. All of that has a potential to cause disease that could be life-threatening, could become an emergency situation. And then a heart attack is something that we found quite majorly around a lot of our plumbers. So when speaking to them, what we have found is the heart attack that they are facing is purely because of the way a plumber works. You rush to one site, you rush to the next site, and there's so much work to get done, so many delays that happen, and the traffic, for many of you said, is probably one of the biggest problems. So stress, you get stress coupled with not eating correctly, coupled with smoking, coupled with staying in the sun too long, and you can just see the recipe for disaster here. And so these serious medical conditions will affect us at some point. Then vehicle accidents, being on the public roads. Again, as we mentioned, sometimes it's traffic, sometimes it's not traffic, but then the speeding that is actually happening on the road. I view traffic sometimes as a good thing because then you cannot speed. Or then again, there's other issues that can come with just normally driving through traffic. What about construction sites? It is so noisy around us that we often don't hear vehicles that are passing behind us, near us, around us. And there is a high probability, especially if you're on a phone. And as a plumber, I've spoken to a few, they are on their phones very often, speaking to clients, speaking back to the office, or speaking to their teams. And a lot of times they are very distracted because of the use of their cell phone. And so construction sites then also increase the likelihood of being struck by a vehicle. And then just different work-related or task-related incidents, such as falling from heights because you're working on ladders, you're working in scaffolding. Some of you are using cherry pickers or scissors lifts at work. Some of you are working on a roof or inside a ceiling, and there is a high possibility for falling from heights. And then the working of or inside excavations, not just performing the excavation itself, but then working inside that excavation, the danger of engulfment, the danger of what you're going to find inside that excavation. Or if the excavation is not looked after properly and inspected every single day like it should be done, anything can happen within that excavation that could potentially cause an emergency situation. Then confined spaces on top of that, for many of us getting into areas that are defined as a confined space, but even a cramped area. So it's not construction related or it's not confined space related, but it is just a cramped area that is very dangerous for us. Working in those areas can also cause a lot of issues for many of our plumbers. Fire and burns, obviously just working with hot works, doing welding or working with electricity, and then the burns that you would find on top of that also from fire or hot works and electrical work as well, and other serious injuries that many of our plumbers have spoken to us about. And this could also be ergonomic related stresses. So things like knee pain, lower back pain, bending constantly on site. You'll eventually find that your knees start hurting. Even your ankles, which is obviously attached to your knees and your hip, all of that is going to get sore because of climbing in and out of a bucky, driving a bucky in traffic, and then having to get to site, climbing up a ladder, bending over all the time, bending to lift things or to carry things. All of these are going to put serious injuries on our body. And then also working with the hand tools and power tools that we're working with, puncture, burns. There's so many other minor injuries that could lead to potentially serious injuries. And this could then lead to what we call an emergency situation. So as a plumber, your job is not easy. And what we are basically saying is a lot of the plumbers out there are facing very similar situations. But who is actually speaking to each other and getting a consistent theme of how do you protect yourself out in that area? So for many of you who might find a fire emergency, well, in emergency evacuation, fire is something that many of us perhaps get surprised by. Remember, it's spontaneous combustion sometimes. Fire can happen at any time. It's not always just because of hot works. And so when a fire occurs, a lot of times we don't know how to deal with it. So it's extremely important that we have a procedure in place, not just for fire emergency, but for fire prevention. See, the best method of firefighting is fire prevention, not creating the fire in the first place. But fire safety equipment will include some of these things. A fire alarm. Now, most companies don't have fire alarms in place. And if they do have a fire alarm, most people evacuate because the alarm is sounded, because they don't do a fire drill, and they actually don't understand that if there is a fire alarm, you need to either wait where you are and be evacuated by the coordinator, or you need to wait for the next emergency alarm to tell you where to be directed to. Now, why do we say that? Well, for one, you have a fire alarm, and if it is by an emergency evacuation point and everybody rushes out to evacuate, well, you could potentially expose yourself to that danger. So that's why it's important to have procedures in place, to have a drill in place, so that if you hear a specific alarm, perhaps a bell ringing, you stay in the place and wait to be evacuated. Whereas if you hear a horn, then you have an evacuation. And the different sounds of the horn would mean full evacuation or partial evacuation. Now, all of this, you might think to yourself, well, what's a lot of work? There's a lot of things involved. How do we know? We have to be prepared. We have to plan for these things. We have to do a drill. This is why it is so important as plumbers out in the industry that you have the necessary documentation in place, that you train for these things. We understand it takes time, but it could potentially save your life in an emergency situation. Then you also have an emergency alarm for robbery. Now, this could be silent alarms. It could be attached to an outside security company. But if somebody sometimes breaks in, the alarm for the actual business goes off. And I don't know how many times we've been in a situation where we hear an alarm and we're inside a building and we're not too sure what that alarm means. Now, it could just be a fault. It could be a fire alarm. It could be evacuation alarm. None of us actually know what it means. And as South Africans, what do? Well, we just carry on working, don't we? Until we get told, because we look around us and we're not in immediate danger. But that's not good enough. We need to actually know what is happening. So as plumbers, it should be your responsibility when you get to site, and why I'm saying it's your responsibility is because your client should include this in the induction, but they don't. Why not ask? There is no reason why we should not ask. In fact, even your call center ladies, your call center agents, or those who are booking, your operational staff that are booking the workout, they could also ask the staff, please, can you send us copies of your emergency evacuation so that our teams, when they get to site, can be inducted on it. Most of the time when I ask a safety officer for information, such as site rules, site specifications, or emergency evacuations, they very happily share this information. So there's no reason why we shouldn't be getting it. Then having first aid equipment, as we mentioned, the different types of first aid boxes that you get and the different types of firefighting equipment that you get, which we spoke about last week in that Toolbox Talk. Then the location of equipment. So here is some signage. If you are on site and you're not too sure what these signs meant, well, you should know these. The red arrow is the location of where you would find firefighting equipment. Then the rest of them will tell you what type of equipment that is. FB2, which is a fire extinguisher, and then on the extinguisher, it'll tell you what type of extinguisher it is. FB3 is a fire hose, so you'll see a big hose reel. And then you get a fire hydrant, and then you get a fire alarm. And then there are additional ones where you can get a fire blanket, and some other companies will have additional firefighting measures within their company. But these are the basics that you are going to be looking for. Make sure everybody knows where to find firefighting equipment or a first aid kit on site, whether you have to bring your own to site or whether you know where the client's is so that you can assist the client in a situation as well. Your emergency routes. When you get into a building, you need to know how you would be able to evacuate safely. So emergency plans that should be conspicuously placed should have a route to your exit. And please remember, all exit routes must be clearly marked and unobstructed. Please do not obstruct an emergency route, even temporarily. Many of us are stacking or storing, pulling our equipment into areas. Perhaps we're going to be installing something, and then we keep the door open by putting something in front of it so that we have ease of access. There are other ways to do it. And it might mean somebody holding the door so that you can come in and out. And you might think, well, that's a waste of a person. I agree. It might be a waste of a person for that time, but you are not obstructing an emergency route, which is a lower risk. So rather have the person being paid to stand there and open a door compared to having a potential for an emergency evacuation going wrong. The cost of life far outweighs anything you do to protect that. So please remember that it might not happen every single day, but that is what prevention is. When it comes to prevention, you don't often see the cost that you are saving. See, when somebody gets injured or seriously hurt, that's a cost to your company. And there are underlying costs, not just your Department of Labor COID cost. It's the cost to replace that person, the time down from that person, the salaries for that person, the insured costs of certain damages, the uninsured cost of certain damages. Please remember, if it costs a person a life, well, then that is way too high to even consider not taking a little bit of extra time to protect the people around you. Your emergency route or plan should also include where your shut-off valves are for any type of shut-off valve. This would include gas, as well as things like knowing where your water point is to ensure that you can actually shut off water if needed. The location of firefighting equipment, the location of assembly points, alarms, and even your local contact numbers for emergency services. So a question to you plumbers, in your own company, in companies that you go to, on the site that you are currently working on, do you know the location of your nearest exit route? Do you know the local contact numbers? Where the alarm is, the assembly point? Do you have your own firefighting equipment, or are you going to be using your clients? Then when it comes down to the emergency contacts, obviously you will have your own contact numbers for those within your company. But remember, you need to have local contact numbers. For many of our plumbers, they are working in and around the entire area of Joburg. Now, you might think to yourself that an ambulance is already slow in order to get to an accident scene. It will be a lot slower if you are working in Joburg CBD and phone the Pretoria ambulance or ER service to come out to you, because that was the copy and paste safety file emergency numbers that we had on our previous safety file. Or perhaps we work in and around Pretoria because those are where our offices are, but we're being sent out to Joburg on a job and we just take our company file with those local numbers. That's not going to help us. You're not going to get a hold of the right fire department. You won't get a hold of the right bomb squad. For any emergency or potential emergency situation, you want to have the local contact numbers of where you are going to be going. Now, for many of you, in fact, all of you, you should know the location of where your next job is. The reason for that is you know where the client is situated and you have to drive out there. So you have an address, which means you have the area where the information that can be attained from is going to be. Take a few minutes. Research on Google. Where is the local hospital? Find out what type of hospital is it. Is it only a clinic? Is it a mediclinic? Is it an actual hospital? Is it a government hospital? Is it a private hospital? It will only take you half an hour max to get all that information and to phone the hospital and find out, do you do incident on duty claims? Now, why do you want to find that out? Well, the reason is you don't want to get to a hospital for an incident on duty and they say, sorry, we don't accept incident on duty claims here. You need to go to this hospital. That could potentially cost the person their life, especially if you are in a rush to get emergency services. So it is so important to have this database set up. Now, the next time you go to that area, you've got the information. The next time you get out to Germiston, you'll know where the emergency services are. The next time you're in Pretoria, you'll know where the emergency services are. So it is a good idea to plan and be prepared for each of the areas that you are working in. Now, you should also have your own emergency plan as a company. Your emergency plan must tell you how to cooperate with external organizations. This would include your clients if you are on their site, or if you needed to phone the SAP, or if you needed to phone the ambulance service. How would you speak to them? Who would be the person phoning them? What would you say to them? Do you have the address and the directions in order to get to the person? Your emergency plan must clearly identify this. If there is a civil defense unit in that area, how the efforts of your organization can be integrated with these for emergency. These are large, big-scale emergencies because some of our plumbers are very big and you might need the defense service to come out to you. What actions must you take for specific emergencies? If somebody is having a heart attack, what do you do? If somebody's fallen off a ladder, what do you do? What if somebody is stuck inside a confined space? What do you do? So all of these most common emergencies, and if we've left something out, remember that is an additional emergency that we have to plan for. So make sure it is simple. Everyone involved can understand it. It should be practical and quickly activated without causing confusion or panic. And that is why it's so important to test it. It must always be coordinated with local services as well as exercised periodically. We cannot stress that enough. We want to have coordination when it comes to our actual plan. So coordinating, these are things like making sure everybody in the company who has been appointed, first aider, firefighter, SHE-rep, emergency coordinators, fire marshals, if you are part of the emergency coordination, you want to know what your position is and what actions you need to take. Then don't only include your emergency team, include the employees. Remember, this is why the coordination between employees and the team is going to work so well. See, the employees will know then who to contact in a first aid or medical service. They will know who to contact during firefighting or the evacuation or the rescue, the isolation of electricity, gas or fuel supplies, or any engineering requirements that might be needed. See, everybody should work together, but one person should be in charge. Who is that person? Do you know who the emergency coordinator is? Hopefully you are never in an emergency. We do hope that this is an insurance policy where you pay for it with your time and your effort, but never claim for it. We do really hope that that is the case, but you need to prepare. You need to test it. You need to do those practical exercises to see whether you are prepared for an emergency situation. You need to know and understand what must be done and also what is your objective. It is to be able to create a simplified emergency situation or emergency protocol, emergency procedure that every single person knows. So as we mentioned, every member of the team and staff should know the location of your fire alarm, emergency alarms, first aid equipment, and firefighting equipment. This goes hand in hand with zero is no accident. And then please ensure that your emergency plan or emergency procedure includes these 6 things. The detection, what is the type of emergency I'm facing? And does the coordinator or emergency team know about it? The decision making is left up to your emergency coordinator. Do you fight the fire? Do you provide first aid? Do you evacuate? Do you call emergency services? That must all be one person who dictates what is happening at that time. Then do you sound the alarm? What type of reaction do you need? Movement to the area of refuge or assembly station. And then transportation, making sure we get any person who needs medical treatment, the medical treatment they need as soon as possible. So thank you very much for joining us. Sorry that I went a little bit over time this morning. Again, our safety thought, safety is achieved by teamwork. So to end off this month, we are going to be looking at arriving alive or driving on our public roads, which is another thing that coming up to the December period is something we want to stress as much as possible. Please look after yourself and others while driving on the road. So thank you very much.